Well, welcome to Palestine Deep Dive. Is it a momentous day? Is it just one exchange of prison guards for another, as some Palestinian commentators have been saying? Either which way, this is an important day because the Israeli elections are over. And in the past few minutes, Prime Minister Lapid has effectively conceded defeat and congratulated Benjamin Netanyahu, who is, as we speak, pulling together a coalition government. And joining me to talk about all of this evening is our old friend, Ian Williams. Ian is in New York. He's the president of the Foreign Press Association, also a former president of the UN Correspondents Association, a columnist with more columns than the Parthenon, most famously. Many other famous things we could mention about Ian, but we simply won't have time to go through all of them. However, he is also a columnist for the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, a sage and sagacious commentator on all things Middle East, all things Israeli and Palestinian. Absolute delight to have you with us, Ian. Welcome. And just before we go to Ian, to all of you watching, and obviously apologies for the short notice, but we thought it was very important to try and get our heads around what all of this means and what this could mean for Palestinians, for any possible peace process, although that seems to have trickled away into the sands of the Negev. But we say to all of you who are watching, please send in your questions. We'll try and get through as many as possible. But we're delighted to have Ian with us. And Ian, thank you. I mean, that going to that comment, I think actually it was by Yara Harawi of the Al-Shabaka network, who writes in the Guardian newspaper in the UK today, and she looks at this election result and she says it is effectively a change of prison guards, not much more than that. But what's your take on the election result and broadly what it means for Palestinians?
Well, I think the interesting bit is that it's not so much the effect on the Palestinians directly. I can't see it being that significant since the so-called progressive liberal government has overseen vicious pogroms by settlers against Palestinian villagers. It's seen the state authorities demolishing people's homes. It's seen state-condoned violence in Haram al-Sharif. It's seen demolitions in Jerusalem itself. So it's almost impossible to think of it actually getting any worse. Where it might have some effect is in the international field, where Joe Biden has said that he won't have anything to do with the Kahanists. But he said that about MBS just before he went and fist pumped with MBS in Saudi Arabia. So, just how staunch he is on the principles. What it will make it easier for, if people are rallying for it, is to roll back against the attempt to outlaw BDS and boycotts, because there's no argument now. These people, it's not an allegation of apartheid. We got people swinging from the rooftops shouting apartheid. We don't want anything to do with the Arabs. We hate them and we want them out. So it's very difficult, even for Labour friends of Israel who will take almost anything, to say that this is in any way a progressive move and that attempts to overturn it or to thwart it are impossible. So I really think it's the international repercussions. And on the other hand, Netanyahu has, he's been, I think if he was in Hogwarts, he'd be in Slytherin because he slithers everywhere, worm-like, and he'll try and wriggle his way through this one and try to say, look, we're really nice guys. He's got Madison Avenue techniques. But if he goes into a coalition with these other people, it's very difficult to appear reasonable if you've got stark raving lunatics who carry guns to demonstrations in Jerusalem.
Well, of course, including the man he's going to go into government with, Ben-Gvir. He was the one who was filmed with a revolver in his holster about trying to. Quite astonishing situation. But yeah, absolutely. As you were saying, I mean, it comes to a pretty pass where we see an Israeli prime minister who is facing corruption charges. So let's not forget, hoping that his coalition partners will somehow spring him from all of that, but being seen through a lens of possible moderation in comparison with the religious Zionists and with the ultra-Orthodox parties that he's now doing deals with. But so it's interesting what you're saying, but when Netanyahu also made his promise during the election that he would annex the settlements in the West Bank, that takes it further, doesn't it? Don't you think?
Well, the very first time I saw the occupied territories, I turned to Palestinian friends and committed thought crime. I said, let them have it. Tell them it's theirs. And at that time, I swore that, you won't be able to see the West Bank for the clouds of dust from retreating Israeli tanks. Because if they think they're getting the demographic nightmare incorporated, they would run like hell. So that's almost to the point now where the Palestinians, they're not going to say it. There's too much nationalism and too much pride and international law. But if they said, okay, annex them, but you have to give us votes, that would alter the whole equation. And look, part of the reason for this is we can't blame the victims, but the ineptitude of various Palestinian approaches. For example, it might have made a difference if the Palestinian authorities had encouraged the Palestinians in Jerusalem to register to vote. I've had these arguments before over Kosovo, for example, when the Kosovars boycotted the Serbian settlement. And the Irish had it once before. Years ago, Sinn Féin was faced with the dilemma of whether to boycott the Westminster or to stay in. And they stayed in and caused trouble right up to the time of the rebellion, which might have been a better move. But it also prepared them to move out immediately when they declared independence. So there are, let's say, light footwork has never been the forte of the Palestinian leadership. They've contented themselves with reciting slogans. And currently, unfortunately, it seems like they're acting as the sort of the sepoys for the Israeli administration.
That's in the Palestinian Authority. That's where the claim has been made about that. But what about these? Some of the claims being bandied about by so-called centrist politicians in Israel that essentially the Palestinian or Arab bloc, didn't do what you were urging, actually getting to people register in East Jerusalem. They're partly to blame. And then, of course, the various centrists and Labour figures are all falling about amongst themselves, blaming each other. But essentially, have we not reached a stage now where what you see is what you get? This is what people have been warning about from the Israeli left, from the real Israeli left, if you like, for a very long time. Is coming to pass because the left gave up.
It certainly did. And look, part of it is I was explaining to some students yesterday about what a dog whistle was. And we have to remember not Ronald Reagan, before him, Richard Nixon, converted the whole of the South, which was once a solid Democratic bloc, into Republican with dog whistles. Basically, he appealed to the racist undercurrents. And that's what all of these politicians are doing. So the competition in Israeli Jewish electorates has been very much who is more anti-Palestinian than the other, in a subtle, coded way. I know the so-called progressive Zionists are basically saying, well, we'll be anti-Palestinian, but in a measured way that won't mess up the donors in Europe and in the US. And unfortunately, the Islamophobes of the Zionist right and most of the Zionists, full stop now, don't really care what people outside think. They've shown that. There is no penalty for them. They have, whatever they do, they're going to get support. They could practically bomb Damascus, Damascus, and they will get support from Washington.
But tell us, for those who may not follow this in as much detail as you do, I mean, you talk about Kahanists. What are Kahanists? And tell us a bit more, if you can, about this guy, Ben-Gvir. We know he comes from the Hebron. We know that he's calling for disloyal Palestinians to be thrown out of Israel, thrown out where we don't know where they're supposed to land up. But tell us more, if you can, about what is informing these ultra-Orthodox religious groups.
Well, first of all, they've been pandered to by the so-called centrists, the so-called moderates, because they need their votes. This is the raw essentials of electoral politics. 30 or 40 years ago, when we first came into this, a lot of the Orthodox didn't want anything to do at all with the Israeli state. They regarded it as an aberration. Some of them still do, the Torah Kartai, but even some of the more sort of mainstream ultra-Orthodox, as we call them, they didn't want anything to do with the Israeli state. They thought it was an abomination. But then they took the line that if the Israeli state wants to give us money, we'll do it, but we won't give them conscripts. We won't let them run our schools. We won't let them police us. We won't let them, enforce any of the normal laws. And they got away with that. And that was the compromise that was paid for and condoned by the so-called moderates. To get those votes, they went along with it. And that has built up. And now we have the settlers. And the same thing has happened. Once it was Labour that introduced settlements into the West Bank, people should remember. It was the Labour Party did it. They put them in there, and they've never totally repudiated them. They've sometimes said, well, maybe, but they've always there. They're every bit as fervent on the settler front as the far right, and they provided the wherewithal of the state for this. Basically, the settlers do what they want, and then the state will come and back them up. Every now and again, there's an aberrant court case which says, really, you can't chase somebody off the land their family have held for 500 years just because a couple of hairy lunatics from Brooklyn have moved in there with Uzis and a copy of the Talmud. But that's gone by the board. I mean, what we've seen now is wholesale. And in the old days, there were penalties. The US said, oh, well, no, you can't do that. It's against the law. It's unhelpful. So we have to negotiate afterwards. And then Trump comes along and says, oh, no, you can annex it. It's yours. And they say, oh, we always said the contiguous settler blocks would be there. The contiguous settler block is all the way from Jerusalem to the Jordan, as far as they're concerned. It's this death by 1,000 cuts. And
Ian, you mentioned at the beginning the ramifications on the international scene. Perhaps that's where this election might have the most effect. And of course, in recent days, we've seen this very powerful report by the special rapporteur, Francesco Albanese, quite explicit about Israeli apartheid. And we've also seen a backtracking by the UK government on the plan by former Prime Minister Liz Truss to move the British embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has said that's not going to happen. And we've also, as just mentioned, heard apparently from the Biden administration that they are not going to deal with some of the people that Netanyahu is going to have in his cabinet and who are going to be supporting his government. So do you think that makes it a little bit easier to get a degree of consistency, something I know that you've been calling for a long time, and which, by the way, very briefly was against Prime Minister Sunak the other day by a Scottish MP who said, are you going to consistently support?
Okay, you're back again now. Good.
I'm back. Yeah, apologies for that. Did you get the gist? I think you got the gist of my rather long-winded question. But do you think that there's already there is kind of a pushback of sorts coming, and that's even before Netanyahu gets into office?
It's back to the future or forwards to the past. In 1967, in 1970, 1980. All European governments, and even to some extent the US, agreed that the occupation was against the law and should be ended. That the settlements were against the law and should be ended. And that's been rolled back by the type of people who rolled through the Labour Party and said that any such suggestion was ipso facto anti-Semitism. Now, people are pushing back on that. And, I think it might be popular with some of the leftist supporters of Palestine. But in this case, the best friends of the Palestinians is Ukraine, because the other countries cannot maintain a coherent international campaign to say that annexation, that the acquisition of territory by force is illegal, and that the annexation is illegal in one case, and then withhold that principle in elsewhere. So it behoves all of us to actually link the two questions together very, very loudly and say, yes, but like the Scottish MP who you just mentioned, we should be saying, yes, we agree about Ukraine. You can't acquire territory by force. No, you can't annex things. So if it's true there, it's also true in the West Bank and in Gaza. And by the way, the Golan Heights, which we've all forgotten about.
Yes, of course.
I mean, the Golan Heights suffers from the fact that the person who's got the best claim on it is a reprehensible genocidal dictator in his own right. So it's a bit difficult to sort of put your hand on your heart and say, principle in this case.
One doesn't want to get too carried away by hopeful signs, but for all of those, and especially on this Palestine deep dive, where we've been calling for consistency from the outset vis-a-vis Ukraine and the Russian occupation and the occupation of the Palestinian territories by Israel, we've also been saying that Britain needs to be consistent. So it was quite cheering today to discover that the British government has sat down with the government of Mauritius and is actually discussing effectively the General Assembly resolutions passed and international law as regards to the Chagos Islands and returning them to Mauritius. So once again, two hopeful signs from Britain on both the embassy and international
While we're
law.
sticking with the empire, let's remember that Australia has walked back on its recognition of Israeli annexations as well.
Absolutely, yes.
So, bonza,
yes. So, yeah. Some hopeful signs, but we shouldn't become too hopeful, because of course what we were talking about at the very beginning, when some of the Palestinian commentators have said, well, it's just one set of prison guards for another. We can see from actually today statistics released on settler attacks on Palestinians that they've risen by 17%, 2002 to 2022.
Under the nice government, remember.
Well, absolutely, and this is before the. And we also we know that, for instance, I mean, a lot of this has gone under the radar. We get this because we see it on social media, and because we have Palestine Deep Dive. We have people like yourself and others. We have many people on the ground, really courageous people on the ground, reporting what's happening. Hebron has effectively been closed off for weeks now. The siege was lifted today. Settlers, armed settlers and settlers throwing rocks, often with Israeli soldiers hanging around, or sometimes even encouraging them. This could get worse 3 years better.
The Orthodox settlers having dance parties in the middle of sacred mosques, while the custodian of the two mosques in Saudi Arabia and the Kingdom of Morocco, who is, I think he's still chairman of the League of Nations, of the Arab League Jerusalem Committee, is quiet. This is sacrilege. I mean, I am open-minded on this, but I know what would happen if a bunch of people with turbans and Uzi and Kalashnikovs went into a synagogue anywhere else in the world and started singing Beladi Beladi. That wouldn't last very long, I'm sure.
Indeed. Well, I mean, taking a step back, what we've seen today is the culmination of yet another election in Israel. I think the fifth in 2 or 3 years. I can't remember, but I mean, in Israel, as you know, they have there's a multi-party proportional representation system. It is open currently to all citizens of Israel, be they Jewish, Palestinian, Christians, or Muslims, or whoever. But do you think this, by the way, this of course is frequently held up by some defenders of Israel to say, well, look, they've got a democratic system in Israel. You try find that elsewhere in the Middle East. But at the same time, do you think that with the emergence of these, as you described them, Kahanists, these religious Orthodox players in Netanyahu's government, do you think there's going to be an effort to strip people of their citizenship, stop them from voting, boot them out, as has been promised?
They've been doing it for decades. Palestinians who live in Old Jerusalem have had their residency rights withdrawn. They've had their passports taken off them. They've been harassed. People whose families have lived for generations in Old Jerusalem have been stripped. They're not allowed to marry. They're not allowed to bring people in. So, I mean, what we've got here is a combination of the finest electoral technology in the world. We've got the Tory party's fascination for multiple elections, producing complete, actually, masturbatory leaders, and which is being emulated in Israel, but based on pandering to the lowest common denominator that attracts all of these fringe lunatics. We've got the ruthlessness of the Republicans' electoral roll purges and the dog whistles. I mean, they've really learned the lesson. They're very astute people, the Israelis. They're cosmopolitan in that sense. They're cosmopolitan where they take their lessons from. And of course, whatever you heard them say about the Arabs and the Islam before, you shouldn't hold it against them when they come and let us say, grope around the crotch of the Gulf states to get what they want. I mean, they're shameless, which pretty much makes them par for any electoral, most elected parties in the Western world now as well. Very few speak up for principle. But one of those principles, which we keep having to remind people, which people are dying for and people in Western Europe are paying for, is the non-acquisition of territory by force.
Mm.
That's what's happening in Ukraine. It's not about Ukraine. It's not whether the Ukrainians are nice or nasty. It's not whether they speak Russian or a dialect of Russian or a separate language. It's the non-acquisition of territory by force.
Indeed. And of course, in the occupied territories, there aren't any elections. I know you were talking earlier about the sort of, allow these settlements to continue because essentially the demographics will never be in anybody's favor other than the Palestinians in Palestine. And therefore, does it really matter? Go and push for elections in the West Bank and Gaza as part of this whole thing. But it's not going to happen, is it? So effectively in the West Bank and in Gaza, the Israeli elections don't play out at all because people don't have a vote. But there again, we have to be honest about this too. The Palestinian Authority has not exactly gone about trying to create a system that is democratic in the areas that it controls.
I mean, the IDF is wandering through all of the allegedly 100% Palestinian-controlled areas. It's arresting and shooting people with complete impunity, as far as we can see. The Palestinian police have never resisted. They're so well disciplined that they haven't even gone as far as the occasional Jordanian takes pot shots at Israelis. It is frightening, a frightening testament to the fact that
as you know,
to go as well as the Israeli government.
Yeah, Israel, of course, is a member of the United Nations, recognized by by all members of the United Nations, I believe. Perhaps you'll tell me if I'm wrong.
There are a couple who refer to it as the Zionist entity.
Yeah, they do that. Palestine, of course, attends the United Nations not as a full member, but there are questions really about. Look, here's a question. This is from Jim in Glasgow. He asks, isn't a big part of the problem that Western governments and media still treat Israel with its elections as if it were just another normal state and refuse to call it an apartheid state? Should we not be listening to Palestinians who've been telling us for decades that this isn't a normal country and we shouldn't normalize it?
Well, of course that's the case. I mean, South Africa had fairly democratic elections. They actually had...
If you were white. If you were white.
Details. They had free trade unions, white. They had, and they had a relatively free press as long as you didn't question the fundamentals. So, that was South Africa, the front line of democracy. That was officially accepted by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the rest of them for many, many years who covered for South Africa. And this, of course, which we should always remind people, this is while Israel was the conduit for smuggled South African diamonds and for smuggling nuclear weapons into South Africa. So,
well, yes. I mean, that's another point, of course, about Israel not being a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty whilst having nuclear weapons. But I don't want to be a nitpicker. But I mean, there is this issue of we know about the occupied territories. We know what's being promised by this Netanyahu government with the extremists within it. But it still has Israeli governments have still had a degree of traction because the democracy they have in pre-48 Israel is inclusive of all citizens at the moment. And in South Africa, it was based on race. Therefore, if you were Japanese, you were classified as European and could vote in white South African elections.
Honorary European, they said.
Yes, European. If you were Chinese or Malay, you couldn't. And of course, if you were a South African Bantu, as they used to say, you could vote in the homelands, and that was it. The designated 14% of the worst land of South Africa. So there is a qualitative difference in the democratic structures of these countries, and yet the outcomes are becoming more and more extreme. And does that become the tipping point, Ian, do you think, for America, Britain, France, possibly France more than other countries, if this new government now begins to do what it wants to do: expel Palestinians, take away their rights, create a theocracy in the Middle East?
Well, France has always blown hot or cold. They're never quite sure whether they hate Jews or Arabs more as a government, especially after Algeria. They supported that they were instrumental in getting Israelis nuclear weapons and arming Israel. But by 1973, they were equivocal because they saw the results in the third world. Do you remember in 1973, Margaret Thatcher, Britain refused to allow its airspace to be used to ship weapons to Israel from the United States. It's an important thing to remember how things have changed because geopolitically it was there. But that was also because Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states were hot in support of the Palestinian rights on racial grounds, not in terms of ethics and civil rights. But we've forgotten all about this because, of course, one of the cleverest moves which the Israelis got the Americans to broker was the so-called Abrahamic Accords. And as I remember, wasn't Abraham about to sacrifice his son? Well, the Arabs have sacrificed the Palestinians on the altar of the Abraham Accords, and they deserve a full share of obloquy for it.
Do you think that what is happening right now, this far-right coalition that's being put together, could result in some pressure and amongst those Gulf states in particular? I think Morocco's another one, South Sudan, who have actually recognized Israel to get them to reverse it, that recognition?
It's difficult to see what the role of... Look, in all of these countries, opinion polls have shown that most of the population supports the Palestinians and detests what the Israelis are doing, regardless of the pragmatic benefits of getting an accord and getting travel and tourists. But none of these governments are in any way dependent on public opinion. They don't have elections. So the question is just how far they can go. And, that's another aspect, because we never want to wish for these things. But if Gvir and the others get their way and start mass deportations of Palestinians, then even, a fairly quiescent Moroccan and Saudi and Gulf population the worm is going to turn, I'm sure.
I mean, we are looking at a situation where in recent months, the pressure, the violence, the settler violence, especially in the West Bank and what have you, really seems to have increased the tempo of it. You get the impression that from talking to people and some of the guests who've come on Palestine Deep Dive, that the pressure that is reaching a boiling point again. And there are some people, of course, who say, well, of course, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I mean, do you see this situation spiraling out of control into another intifada, another intense bout of violence? And an intense bout of violence could actually begin to shift public opinion quite dramatically in a way. It hasn't for quite some time before.
But, the Palestinians have been disarmed. On the other hand, the Israeli state has been completely riddled with, Kahanist worms. At one point, most of the state apparatus and the army were Labour Party people who had some residual memories of ethics and conscience and law. It's been completely dominated for years now with Orthodox, with settlers, with far-right people, and they're completely partial. You've seen those pictures of the IDF handing over weapons to the settlers to attack innocent Palestinian civilians. You've seen them in the West, in Jerusalem. You've seen them raiding funerals, for God's sake. What is it about Palestinian funerals that so infuriates these people? They're violating all the traditional laws of humanity, but they're getting away with it. If they start mass evacuations, then who knows? It's possible the US government might turn around and say, no, we're not going to send you any more aid. The checks stop now. I mean, there's already been a big sea change. The Democratic Party, which used to be 150% pro-Israeli, is now, no, not so much. Whereas the Republican Party, which is traditionally the party of anti-Semites, is now totally pro-Israeli and still anti-Semitic, as far as we can tell from the loose comments from people about high-ranking Jewish officials. So it's it's there in the US. In Britain, it's almost, there's no popular constituency for Israel outside Labour Friends of Israel. Oh, the most vociferous and eloquent and convincing opponents of the of what the Israelis are doing are the children of Holocaust survivors. You just have to remember Gerald Kaufman.
Absolutely. I mean, remember him very, very well.
I believe he was formerly on the board of deputies of British Jews. And when he pointed out that his grandmother would be horrified to know that her memory was being invoked to justify the type of bombing and beatings up going on in the occupied territories in Gaza, they even tried to whisper anti-Semitism about him. Now they will get away with it. 20 years ago, they didn't, or they couldn't quite. They tried. They pushed it gently. Now they will be outright with it. You get MPs, you get friends of Starmer who would get up outright and say that Gerald Kaufman was an anti-Semite.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard that from them, of course, because I suspect that half of those MPs wouldn't even know who he was and probably wouldn't understand half of the arguments he would have come out with. Unfortunately, in British politics, we suffer what you suffer from in American politics, a paucity of talent. But looking ahead, though, we know that this coalition is being formed. We know that is going to be the most right-wing administration in Israeli history. It's a million miles from many previous Israeli governments, and we know what its ambitions are. So does this really begin to test the resolve of those who will not brook any criticism of Israel? And does it mean that there's going to be obviously public opinion changes? But will it mean more decisions, as we've just seen, as from the British government, a step back from, for instance, putting the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Do you think this is a turning point, perhaps, in changing world global opinion?
Well, we could say, inshallah, but I would like to think so, but I'm not entirely convinced, because the governing authorities in many places seem to have unlimited tolerance for Israeli anti-Arab racism, and in their own ranks quite often. So they're playing on a rich field there. I would like to think so. I'd love to think that the Western governments will get together and say, look, we can't really stand up and wave from the treetops about Ukraine. We must stand together on this one and draw some lines in the sand. And the line has got to be somewhere around the green line.
Yes. Well, actually, I'll just say finally that, I mean, we know there's been this, you've probably seen it, there's been this is coming to British domestic politics again, but the Al Jazeera files on the Labour Party, we know that certain words are used as like trigger words, such as Palestine, when party officials are scouring the social media posts of people who want to stand for public office. But recently, at a university not altogether too far away from here, the Prevent program was used to evoke a caution about inviting a particular speaker, and the word that had kicked it all off was the word Palestine. So there is a kind of unthinking stupidity that has worked its way into the body politic.
William, we don't just have non-persons anymore. We have non-countries and non-people.
I'm afraid so. Well, look, Ian, thank you very, very much, and thank you for all of those who joined us, and at such short notice. Sorry we didn't get to hear more from you, but we've been delighted to have Ian Williams as our guest on Palestine Deep Dive on the night that somebody who's still facing corruption charges, Benjamin Netanyahu, is pulling together.
Donald Trump for a moment.
No, not you. You're not pulling together a cabinet, and neither are you on corruption charges. No. So, look, thank you very much, Ian, and we hope to have you on again soon. And we just leave hoping that things can actually get better before they get worse. But where we're sitting right now, it doesn't really look that way. Anyway, thank you from all of us here at Palestine Deep Dive, to Omar, Alex and Ahmed and the team. And thank you once again to Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association in New York. Good night.